national criminal justice reform and outlines concrete steps to address the country's mass incarceration crisis and provides actionable solutions to creating a fairer and more equitable justice system. If you tuned in last week for our panel on youth homelessness, you know that treat kids like kids is one of the key principles laid out in the blueprint. But even as we advocate for reform that treats kids like kids, we must make sure that this includes all kids. Today, our panelists will discuss how racial biases that are baked into our laws, policy, and society as a whole prevent that from being the case for children of color and the work that is being done to counteract that. Before I introduce them, as usual, I want to say thank you to all of our amazing justice volunteers. The work you do is amazing. Many of you have signed on to be Youth Justice Action Month ambassadors in light of this month of October. And the research that you've done has allowed us to create amazing infographics that we are going to be sharing with you later this month. And so thank you very much for the work that you do. And toward the end of this webinar, you will hear from Molly Bernstein, our Associate Director for Volunteer Research and Advocacy, about how you can be more involved in our teams and work to bring about youth justice. And now for our panelists. Joining us, we have Professor Kristin Nicole Henning, Agnes W. Williams Research Professor, Professor of Law, Director of Juvenile Justice Clinic, Associate Dean for Clinics and Experiential Learning at Georgetown Law Center. We also have Marshan Allen, Project Manager at Restore Justice, Professor Randy Hertz, Vice Dean, Professor of Clinical Law and Director of Clinical and Advocacy Programs at New York University School of Law, and Elizabeth Weill-Greenberg, Staff Reporter at The Appeal. Thank you all for being with us today. And as they start the discussion, if you all have any questions, please feel free to write them in the comment box along with your name and where you're from, and we will do our best to get to them at the end. I also encourage you to tweet during the webinar to share your reactions and what you're learning. And there'll be a post in the comment section with more info about that. And so to start the discussion, Chris is going to kind of frame the issue and tell us why we should be caring about this topic.
All right, thank you, Kelly. Can everybody hear me? Excellent. I am so happy to be here. Thank you to the Justice Collaborative for convening this conversation. And this is a critically important question. And the question that we are asked is, why do we care about this topic, criminalizing normal adolescent behavior in communities of color? And I want to set the stage by letting folks know, or reminding folks that researchers tell us that after the 0 to 3 year range, adolescence is the most important developmental stage in our lives. Adolescence is the last opportunity to really have a great impact on the path, or putting youth on a path to success. Also, though, it is also an opportunity to really do measurable harm to teenagers, in thinking about the impact of policing and criminalizing normal adolescent behaviors. We have to remember that the ways in which we respond to common, typical adolescent misbehaviors has a profound impact on the developmental trajectory. So when I think about why we're going to have this conversation today, I think all of us should care about criminalizing normal adolescent behaviors, particularly among children of color, if we care about ensuring developmental equity, if we care about producing a generation of successful adults, and if we care about public safety. And with regard to developmental equity, it is the idea that every single child of whatever race has a right to healthy adolescent development, pure and simple, and all that that entails. Healthy cognitive development, equal opportunity for education, equal opportunity for skills, vocational development, equal opportunity to go to college, and the like. And we'll talk about that more as the webinar progresses. But this notion of producing, the second thing is producing the next generation of successful adults. If we are criminalizing normal adolescent behaviors among children of color, we are excluding them from the fundamentals of housing, school, public aid, employment, and all the collateral consequences that come with criminalization and indeed healthy adolescent development. And third is the question of public safety. And that the idea is that when we over-criminalize, we subject our students or youth of color to hyper surveillance. We socialize them to fear and to resent police officers, which actually increases risk of harm to society instead of decreasing it. So this is a critically important issue along all of those variables. And Kelly, I don't know if you want me to talk a little bit about, in setting the stage, talking about the statistics a bit. All right. So I imagine that folks who are attracted to a webinar like this know that the racial disparity is profound. But to start us off, it's worth mentioning, particularly with regard to African-American youth, although according to the most recent statistics, census data, and Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention data, although Black youth make up only 14% of all youth in the United States, they account for 35% of all juvenile arrests, 36% of all juvenile court referrals, 40% of detained youth, 40% of youth formally processed in juvenile court, 37% of youth actually adjudicated, right, to conclusion, 47% of youth who are judicially transferred or waived up to adult criminal courts, and 42% of youth who are placed in secure residential settings after a finding of adjudication. So, and that's just the racial data. The racial data is much more robust and available for African-American youth. We need to do a much better job about collecting data, current and contemporary data for Latinx youth, Native American youth, and Asian American youth in jurisdictions where there are disparities in those regards.
Thank you, Chris. And kind of to give a little meat to the statistics that she shared, we're going to hear from Marshan about, the real life impact of criminalizing young people of color and how, that kind of creates its own loop of criminality and kind of feeds into itself.
Good evening, and thank you for allowing me to be on the show. Well, as you know, well, the viewers don't know, but my experience as a 15-year-old, I was charged and convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to mandatory life without parole in prison. So I've had some really experience with the criminal justice system. And one of the things I want to point out is, like, through that experience, I learned that a lot of the behaviors that was normally in school that would usually result in kids being sent to detention or suspension and stuff like that now results in being arrested. And we know that once that first encounter with the police and the rest of like that actually leads to more encounters and things like with the police and as the juveniles get older in their future interaction with the police, I'm sorry. But as an example, I know when I was younger as well, where we will be out hanging out with our friends doing absolutely nothing wrong. And the police will come up to us and they would search us, frisk us, make us pull down our pants in the street. And I know that used to make us feel resentful of the police. We didn't trust them. We feared them in some ways. So a lot of times when the police would come up, we would run away from them, which in their eyes make them fear that we are doing something wrong, and will cause just those interactions to constantly be fed on and continued and things like that. But that criminalization is definitely real. Another way that it plays out, when I was incarcerated, I met a lot of guys who were, you know, because of their felony conviction, they believed that they would not be able to get jobs. They believe that, and they haven't even tried in some instances because they just believe that the narrative of you having a felony conviction, no one's going to hire you and things like that. But a lot of them never even tried to do that, and that led them to getting out of prison. And instead of going back, you know, trying to live their life more productively, led them back to selling drugs or doing things that they shouldn't have done because of what they was told and what they end up believing was the case.
Thank you, Marshan, and thank you for sharing about your own experience. And Chris, kind of to build up off of that, can you talk about how policing compromises and impedes like healthy adolescent development?
Yeah, I think Marshan is right on, and talking about the ways in which, particularly this notion of homelessness, hopelessness. You sort of give up after being under constant surveillance by police officers and the like. And I should back up a little bit to give context as well, that as Kelly indicated, I am the director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic at Georgetown Law. And in our clinic, we represent children accused of delinquency in the District of Columbia. So our children are arrested from anything from petty adolescent offenses to much more serious. And so much of what I'll talk about today is arising out of what Marshan talked about. It's real live experiences and observation. And so definitely we can see questions coming in. Definitely hold us accountable to combine the statistics with the realities of what young men and women of color are experiencing out on the streets. So what I want to say about to giving really more meat on how policing and criminalizing normal behaviors impacts adolescent development is to say that what many of us, I think, fail to take into account, that policing and juvenile justice involvement in and of itself is a traumatic experience. Right. And I think that's really what Marshan set up for us. And the first thing that I was going to talk about is the impact of policing and court involvement on the mental health of children. So not only can we observe our own clients suffering in the ways that Marshan just talked about, but the research confirms, empirical research confirms, that children who are over-policed, subject to racism in particular, and court involvement, tend to experience anxiety, feelings of depression, feelings of hopelessness, post-traumatic stress disorder, hypervigilance in their day-to-day lives. And these kinds of mental health impacts are over and beyond what they already come into the justice system with. I think probably most of us know on a webinar like this that children, that many of the children who enter the juvenile justice system are experiencing, or enter the system experiencing traumas such as violence in their communities, extreme poverty, family discord, and the like. And so then you over-police them, bring in children into the system, and exacerbate those issues by not providing them the services they need, and causing anxiety. And I see one of the questions that we are getting, and I really appreciate this, is how do we define normal adolescent behaviors? And I really appreciate that. I think that's a really good question. And so let me pause my conversation about the impacts and just say, when I'm talking about normal adolescent behaviors, I'm talking about all the things that we did as teenagers, okay? So that might be the school fight, right? That doesn't involve extreme injury or violence to another, but kids getting into fights with one another. I'm talking about children talking back in schools and being accused of threats And so what we know from the research is adolescent, there's research on adolescent aggressive speech as a part of normal engagement, if you will. So that is being criminalized. We'll come to this in a little bit, but the ways in which children's attire is mislabeled, so that children who hang out with their friend sets, right? You and I were able to go out to the movies or go to the mall in groups, but young children of color are often mislabeled and tagged as gang members, right? And their behavior is perceived as violent, when in fact, if we saw a group, to be quite frank with you, of white kids in the mall, we wouldn't think of them as engaging in criminal behaviors. And I can go on and on about that. And I even think, and I really like to say this in spaces like this, even some of the behaviors that arrive in court or charged in court as felonies, like felony robberies, even felony burglaries, all sound very serious offenses. But if you unpack often what's happening, you often have children being egged on in peer sets or groups, run and grab, you see a friend on the football field and you run and you grab something from them and you run off. That is technically meets the elements of a robbery, but is it the type of robbery, violent stranger type robbery that you think of when you think of a violent crime under the FBI index? Thinking about burglaries, we have represented children who do what, to be quite frank with you, some of us on the call maybe have done, of crashing a party, right, without an invitation, is technically entering and crossing the threshold of a residence of another, is technically a burglary. But is that the type of adolescent behavior that warrants severe criminal involvement? We've got children who have taken their parents' cars or a friend's car without permission to ride around the block, and they bring it back, but that is a felony, car theft, those kinds of things. And I do not mean to minimize the fact that there are serious crimes out there, but I think much, and in fact, the research shows that, up to 80% of what is in juvenile court is low-level, non-violent property offenses. And mind you, that 80% doesn't even include like the robberies that I just told you about, right? Those would be counted as the 20% felonies. So that's what I mean by criminalizing normal adolescent behavior. So to get back to what I was saying, what are some of the impacts of policing and criminalizing normal adolescent behavior? And I've already talked about the mental health implications, the traumatic impact of policing, making kids anxious and hypervigilant at all times. And I want to move from that into the physical implications, right? So if you've got a child, imagine what it would be like to walk into a convenience store every day, or into a mall, once a week, and be under constant surveillance. What does that psyche do to the physical and the medical health? Right? And I often, when I do trainings on implicit racial bias, I ask the audience to imagine how it must feel to be tense all the time. Your stomach is in knots, your shoulders are in knots, your jaw is clenched, your fists are tight. And so what kind of long-term cumulative impact does that kind of anxiety have on your physical health? So the collateral consequences are real. All right. Another way in which adolescent development is undermined by hyper-policing and criminalizing normal adolescent behavior is in identity formation. So they say that, so I'm trying not to use, sort of scientific words, but we form our identities in adolescence. We try on our identities, figure out who we are. We develop our self-esteem and our pride in ourselves and our pride in our race during adolescence. So imagine if every day somebody is telling you that your behavior is wrong, your behavior is inappropriate, your behavior is criminal, right? You begin to question your own identity. You begin to question your own self-esteem, your own worth. And importantly, you get confused about your own racial identity. Is it bad to be Black? Is it bad to be Latinx? Is it bad to be? So parents have to do double time for children of color who are criminalized in this way to help them establish a healthy individual identity and a healthy racial identity. Another way that we have to mention is the ways in which policing and criminalizing today undermines access to basic fundamental education, right? So we have to talk about that. That's the most obvious way. But what we're saying is if you have SROs, school resource officers, that arrest children in the school, suspend and expel children from school, you are denying them basic education at a time when the brain needs to be most engaged. That adolescent brain development, during adolescent brain development, it is critical to keep the brain what we call nimble and active and engaged in strategic thinking. The researchers tell us that when you put a child in detention to engage in sort of the repetitive, dull, non-creative activities, that it's not good for healthy adolescent brain development. This is this idea that you can actually do harm to the brain during adolescence. And so we need to keep kids in school, cognitively engaged, strategically thinking, right? Coming up with innovative, creative ideas. So just a couple more. One, I like to talk about the ways in which adolescent development is compromised is the ways in which we prohibit children from engaging in leisure and recreation. Right? So you're like, well, what's the deal about that? Well, there's actually research out there that shows, all of us take leisure and recreation for granted. We would be so stressed out if we didn't have time to just relax and relate. But the research on adolescence and leisure and recreation is critically important. Leisure and recreation is a time during adolescence is a time when children begin to figure out what they like, what they don't like, what they're good at, what skills they're good at, what they're not good at. They begin to develop a social network. They blossom out of their shell and begin to understand who they are. They develop leadership skills, networking skills, and they get to relax, which is critically important to healthy adolescent development. So when you shoot and kill a child like Tamir Rice for carrying a toy gun, you are signaling not only that his life is not valuable, but you're signaling to all other children of color that they aren't allowed to have the leisure and recreation time that everyone else does. And then I'll end with this one. There's so many other ways in which policing and criminalizing normal adolescent behaviors impact adolescent development, but one is the one I alluded to at the start, which is this idea of creating distrust in adolescents at a time when it is critically important for them to develop adult allies and adult supports. So if they go to a school and they feel like school administrators are targeting them, criminalizing them, and they're unable to find those networks or those mentors and those adult allies, we are doing our children a disservice in all of those areas that I mentioned, including public safety, developmental equity, and the like. So there's so much more to say, but I definitely will stop and hear, certainly want to open for everyone else.
So I think I'll jump in here if I can. And I'm Randy Hertz. I teach the NYU Juvenile Defender Clinic. And like Chris's clinic, my clinic represents young people accused of crimes. And we do it in the New York City Family Court. And we see a lot of the same kinds of abuses and injustices that Chris has seen in her clinic. I wanted to approach this from a slightly different angle, which is all the things that Chris said are supremely important for people to know. And what I wanted to talk about is the fact that legislators and judges and policymakers often don't seem to get it. Particularly white legislators and policymakers and judges who come from privileged backgrounds just don't seem to understand what's going on. And they all recognize that there are disproportionate numbers of young people of color being prosecuted in family court and also in adult criminal court, and they can't seem to understand why. And some of the things that Chris talked about are, of course, the crucial reasons why. So first of all, as Chris said, schools, particularly schools in low-income neighborhoods of color, disproportionately refer kids to family court or to adult criminal court for prosecution for things that white kids are not prosecuted for. So Chris mentioned the school fights, the kinds of fights that in white affluent neighborhoods would result in the school talking to the parents of the kids and working things out and telling the parents to lecture their children, but instead get referred to for prosecution. Or, for example, and I'm sure Chris has seen cases like this, my clinic has represented kids who are accused of robbery in the second degree for taking a piece of food from another kid in the school cafeteria. One of the cases my clinic had was two 11-year-old little boys took a stick of gum from another 11-year-old little boy in the schoolyard and said that they would beat him up if they didn't get the stick of gum, and they were all charged with robbery in the second degree. Now, that's of course crazy, and it would never happen with white kids. It would still never happen in an affluent neighborhood, but the school referred this to the police, and the police referred this to the prosecution, and this was charged in family court. So this is not to minimize, as Chris said, that there are also serious crimes being prosecuted in family court, but there are these cases where if they were white affluent kids, they certainly would not be prosecuted. In addition, once they are referred to prosecution, the normal mechanisms that the system is supposed to use to divert cases out of the system somehow don't seem to happen when they are kids of color, and especially low-income kids of color. We have something called adjustment, which is supposed to divert cases, and yet it doesn't seem to happen nearly as often with young kids of color as it does with white kids. And we see that kind of racially skewed handling of cases at each stage of the process. As Chris said, it happens at the front stage when cases are referred to court. It happens when cases are charged. It happens when plea offers are made. It happens when prosecutors decide whether or not to drop cases. It happens when judges decide whether or not to take a guilty plea and for what. It happens when at sentencing, and it happens on probation. So these are the things that people who are involved in the system as lawyers or as policymakers understand and know all too well. But unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be getting across to judges and legislators and policymakers, and it needs to.
Thank you so much. And Randy, that actually leads us into the next topic, which is more so the legal context of the issue. And you kind of mentioned some ways how like laws and the procedures work to criminalize young people. And so if we could talk about what legal mechanisms should be in place to address the role that these racialized perceptions of criminality have on children of color.
So I can start us off, and I think I'll mix in some laws that hurt, our kids, and then potentially ways to fix them. I think one of the things that we've already alluded to, though, is overbroad. And so let me be specific about it, about how kids are referred from the school system in a lot of ways to the juvenile courts. And one is through overbroad disciplinary codes within the school system. So overbroad statutes, also criminal codes in the state statutes that penalize, for example, disturbing the schools or disturbing the peace. And one of the commenters on one of the participants wrote about criminal trespass. So a kid who takes a shortcut to get into class or to get into the school gets charged with criminal trespass. But the problem is this: it's overbroad. One of the many problems is overbroad statute. So that's the first thing. And you say what laws could be put in place is one is decriminalizing a number of normal adolescent behaviors, including things that we often think of as status offenses, such as truancy. Another one is, and decriminalizing disturbing peace at school. Another one, though, is, and there's been a lot of really good attention on this, which is dress code provisions and hairstyles that are specifically precluded in student disciplinary codes, and that are targeted, to be quite frank, at children of color, right? So some of it will be, you can't wear gang colors. In the District of Columbia, I just had a student last week tell me that there was a time in which one of her classmates kept getting sent home because she was wearing a scarf. And why was she wearing a scarf? Because her hair, she hadn't had time to get her hair done. But that was prohibited. You can't wear scarves at school. Natural African-American hairstyles, such as my own, being prohibited at schools. So decriminalizing some of those or taking those out of the school disciplinary codes. I think another one is removing, to be quite frank, I'm going to go radical on it, right? Removing school resource officers from the schools altogether. And to make it less sound a little less radical, how about we just replace school resource officers with counselors? There's a really great report out, counselors, I apologize for not knowing the exact name, but counselors, not police, is what we need in the school system. I think another way in which the laws need to adjust is stop and frisk practices, right? We're hearing about stop and frisk practices, in New York years ago, not even that long ago, but in New York, and I have to tell folks, it is still happening. And so what do I mean by stop and frisk practices? I mean very much that our clients tell us here in the District of Columbia that they walk down the streets, walk out of their apartment buildings, walk on their way to school, and police officers drive by in their neighborhood and ask them to stop, lift up their shirts, and expose their waistband so that they can see that the young person is not armed and dangerous. And that is extremely traumatizing for a child, particularly over and over and over and over again. And so sometimes folks will say to us, well, you got a gun off the street. Well, the reality, the statistics show that the percentage, the tiny percentage, minuscule percentage, like 1 and 2%, of all of those stops yield anything dangerous like a weapon. And more important, think about all those children who are stopped and who don't have any illegal contraband, right? And what kind of impact does that have on their psyche, and on their mental health, and importantly, on their relationship with police officers in the future? Right. And so, again, building that resentment against police officers. And again, I can go on and on. I'll let other folks jump in and see if there are other ways in which laws are criminalizing our adolescents. And at some point, Kelly, I'd love to come back and talk about the ways in which other stakeholders, prosecutors and the like can help.
Absolutely. And before we get into that, Randy, do you want to say anything else?
Yeah, so I'll just reinforce what Chris said about the stop and frisk problems in New York City. They still run rampant. So they are better than the really awful, the horrendous abuses of recent years, but it still regularly happens. And as Chris said, they yield contraband in only a minuscule number of cases. And so what we're doing is criminalizing vast numbers of young people of color. And as Chris said, a number of those young people are allowed to then walk on and they're stigmatized. But then there are a whole bunch of young people of color who are stopped by the police for no reason whatsoever. And the police then decide that the young person has an attitude because the young person doesn't like being stopped and forced to lift their shirt and maybe says something to the cop that the cop doesn't like. And so suddenly the kids are charged with violations like disorderly conduct or resisting arrest or obstructing governmental administration or some invented crime, and then they're prosecuted for something that wouldn't have happened at all if it hadn't been for the fact that the police stopped them and then were disrespectful and confrontational to the young person. That also happens in schools with the school safety officers. The school safety officers, especially in schools in predominantly low-income neighborhoods of color, those school safety officers get into confrontations constantly with the kids. And then the kids get arrested for being disrespectful to the school safety officer, which is described again as obstructing governmental administration or resisting arrest or something like that. And so we're just generating these fictitious crimes and sending kids to court for no reason whatsoever and saddling them with a criminal history.
And can I add something? There is something else that I think that should be addressed too, and this is our accomplice liability laws that allows prosecutors to charge groups of juveniles for the actions of one or a few. We had this case here in Illinois, Lake County case, where we had a group of teenagers who were going to steal a car, which is, I don't know, when I was young, I stole cars, and not saying it is right. But these individuals went out to attempt to steal a car at nighttime. The homeowner came out and shot at the group and killed the 14-year-old that was there. And the prosecutor there decided to charge the other 5 youth with first-degree murder. And they didn't have any weapons. They didn't harm anyone. They didn't shoot and kill anyone. But these laws, or these accomplice liabilities laws, allow the prosecutor to get all these youth and not just charge them with a crime, which they should have been charged with as far as like their attempt to steal a car, but it used our state's most severe penalty to try to punish these youth. And luckily, with public pressure, the prosecutor eventually lowered the charges. But I'm using an example to show even the prosecutor's discretion. Like, just because you have this tool doesn't mean that you should use it. And there was no reason that youth that goes out to commit nonviolent crime should ever be charged in a way that they've been charged with first-degree murder, which could have led to them being sentenced to life without the possibility of parole in prison and other extreme sentences. So I think that that's one thing that needs to be done legally, is to look at our accomplice liability laws, especially how they pertain to youth. And because we know that youth typically commit crimes in groups, and they're more susceptible to peer pressure. So it's possible that we have a group of youth and we have 1 or 2 members that's doing something wrong, and the other 2 go along with it, may not even be full participants, but are there or whatever, and they get caught up in this web as well and end up being faced with adult consequences and long prison sentences as a result.
Marshan, thank you so much for bringing that up and for mentioning, the role of prosecutorial discretion. And so that we can kind of open up that topic to talk more about what the role of all of these stakeholders, should be playing with this issue, from advocates to police to prosecutors and judges and legislators and down the line. And so, Chris, I know you wanted to weigh in on that.
Yeah, and so both Randy and Marshan have made great points that I can pick up from. So first, with going back to Randy's point, then I'll come back to Marshan's, this notion of policing. Man, Randy, you nailed that. This idea of what happens in a stop and frisk, and it escalates into something else. And in our jurisdiction, we were really getting a lot of assault on a police officer charges, which was really all about a kid being stopped for no reason at all. And then it escalates into an argument. And then, because why does it escalate into an argument? Because he's a teenager and feels like he was stopped unfairly. And so he talks back. And then it becomes something much more than that. And so that's a place to start in thinking about policing and what police officers can do as a stakeholder group. One thing that folks should know is there's an organization called Strategies for Youth, led by Lisa Thoreau up in Massachusetts. And they have done some research around reviewing police standards and police regulations, and have found that there are many states, the vast majority of states have no regular, or police departments, not states, but police departments and states don't have state standards on policing youth, policing adolescents, and policing children. And those police departments that do have standards, or those states that do have standards, are wholly inadequate to really provide police officers with the guidance that they need for adolescent appropriate policing, for de-escalation and the like. So that's the starting place, right? So can we improve standards, right? Have the community involved and at the table, youth versus voices at the table, researchers on adolescent development at the table, and talk about adolescent appropriate policing standards. In addition to that, police officers need implicit bias training. And I'm very, very clear that implicit bias training alone is not enough. But the research has shown, and I'm sure many of you on the call are aware of Philip Atiba Goff's research around perceptions of childhood innocence, finding that children are young children, Black children in particular, are often perceived to be older, right, than white children, and perceived to be more dangerous and more culpable. That affects policing. So having that kind of training that helps officers deal with that and helps develop strategies to combat implicit racial bias is critically important. I think tied to that is tracking data according to race, having standards that eliminate stop and frisk, not just because the courts are going to throw out the evidence, but because it's bad practice, right? And that it doesn't actually, in the long run, improve public safety. So that's on the policing side. On Marshan's point, I really love this idea of revisiting accomplice liability as a statutory reform, right? So for legislators, but moreover, Marshan talked about prosecutorial discretion. I say all the time that prosecutors, and so does, let me say, give credit first to Angela Davis, who writes about prosecutors. But in my work in juvenile court, I always say that prosecutors are the gatekeepers of juvenile court. It is prosecutorial discretion that can push back on inappropriate police conduct or inappropriate stop and frisk or ineffective stop and frisk. That's number one, by refusing to prosecute cases that come in with a Fourth Amendment violation. They can make a big difference in charging decisions, both having standards and having practices for charging decisions that are adolescent appropriate and fair and equitable across race. And they can do that through standards, they can do that through training. And I do want to give out a shout out to the progressive prosecutor movement that is very much afoot right now. Much of my opportunities, and I'm grateful for the opportunities to do implicit racial bias training, are in prosecutor's office, right? Philadelphia, Florida, Philadelphia, Seattle, a number of prosecutors' offices have been recognizing, in juvenile court in particular, the need for this type of implicit bias training and to have hard conversation and tracking data on racial disparities, because it's too easy to blame the police officers. It's too easy. I have people who say to me, well, I can't fix racial disparities in juvenile court from where I sit. And I say every single stakeholder has a role to play. And prosecutors are among the most powerful. Judges are powerful, obviously. I think in the Fourth Amendment context, there's a number of us have started to do research on what does it mean to be a person of color in contact with the police, and how do you evaluate the legality and the validity of a stop, or a search, a consent to search, or a seizure with a child of color without taking race into account. And one final example, just to drive that home, is think about flight, right? So for those of you who are not lawyers on the phone call, flight, i.e. running from the police, is often considered consciousness of guilt, right? But let's stop and think about adolescent development and everything we know about teenagers, right? And let's think about everything we know about race relations in America. So I asked the question, why do children run from the police? They run because their friends run. They run because they're teenagers, and that's what teenagers do. Why do Black children run? right? Why do other children of color run from the police? Because they're terrified, right? And so it is unfair to consider flight, as we call it, or running from the police, a measure of consciousness of guilt. Okay, so those are the kinds of examples. And I think the final group, you know, I know there are a number of educators on this webinar, and I really, really appreciate that. You know, what I say to school administrators is being courageous. Not too long ago, I feel like maybe a couple of months ago, the Chicago school superintendent, and I know she's under fire on some other things these last couple of days, but previously she threatened to remove all police officers from the schools entirely after a video was released of a SRO, a school resource officer, dragging a kid down a stairwell at school. And she's like, you know, this is intolerable. This is unacceptable. And if we don't fix this, I'm going to remove school resource officers. Now, she's under fire for different reasons, but I love her courage for at least coming out and saying that. So.
Thank you, Chris. That was a ton of really awesome information. And I know that a lot of the attendees are asking for like the stats and the resources and book recommendations. So we will absolutely get that to you all after this webinar. Now, can we quickly talk about what legal and policy changes are taking place, and you know, whether there are success stories or initiatives that happen to be working around the country?
I just don't want to be the only one talking. That's why I'm slow. Randy, you look like you unmuted too. You want to go first?
Sure. I'll just mention the big development in New York, which is raise the age. And until recently, New York was one of only 2 states, along with North Carolina, that had an age cutoff of 16 for juvenile court, which meant that any child who was over the age of 16 at the time of the alleged crime had to be prosecuted in adult court. We've had that system in New York since the 60s, and New York has been one of the most punitive states in the country in terms of both that and also what they call reverse transfer, in which kids who are even younger than 16, 13, 14, or 15, and charged with certain enumerated felonies would start in adult court and be presumptively prosecuted in adult court and would have to be waived down to juvenile court with extenuating circumstances. The latter, the reverse transfer, still continues to exist, unfortunately, but at least with Raise the Age, both New York State and North Carolina have finally changed the 16-year-old cutoff. And in 2017, New York changed the system so that as of October 1st, 2018, kids who are 16 can be prosecuted in juvenile court, and as of October 1st, 2019, kids who are 17 can be prosecuted in juvenile court. Now, that doesn't mean that they all get prosecuted in juvenile court. In contrast to states where the age cutoff is routinely 18, New York has this hybrid system in which some kids who are 16 and 17 continue to be prosecuted in adult court, whereas other kids are transferred down to juvenile court. But it's better, and we're seeing some good effects. So in the first 9 months of Raise the Age, what we've seen is that of the adolescent offenders who were being considered for transfer to juvenile court, 79% of them were transferred, which means that out of 776 cases, 600 of them were transferred to family court. So that's better. Also, kids who were under 18 and who were being held in Rikers Island, along with adults in pretrial detention, pretrial confinement, are now being held in a juvenile facility called the Horizon Juvenile Facility. So this is better. It's still not good enough, but it's better. So that's one. Chris?
Sorry, I forgot to mute. So that's an excellent example. What I wanted to do is to give a shout out to youth activism. And in particular, to give a shout out to the Advancement Project, would just put out a great resource guide called We Came to Learn. And it is a really fabulous piece. And in it, they document several examples of youth campaigns to reform, particularly obviously in the school space, because that's what that particular publication is about. But youth in South Carolina, after the Naya, Kinney, and Shakara example, where the Shakara, the young girl who was snatched from her chair by the school resource officer for using her cell phone, but the rallying by young people after that was significant. Youth campaigns out in California, and some of the successful examples that the Advancement Project lists are young people who are petitioning against violence and brutality by school resource officers. They are demanding transparency and accountability for school resource officer contact and use of force, essentially data collection by race. Demanding that there be reporting of suspensions, arrests, and expulsions by race. And also what I thought was significant, that the children, even who are at risk of violence themselves, are protesting against the increase in funding for school police officers, and instead demanding investments in real solutions that enhance public safety, right? Instead of the go-to ways that adults try to make them safe. So I just wanted to shout out youth advocacy and youth voices in reform, and there are many other sort of legislative examples too across the country.
And I want to say I'm a part of a national network called ICANN, Incarcerated Children Advocacy Network, and it's made up of individuals who were either charged with murder as juveniles or sentenced to life without parole as juveniles. And one of the things that we have been doing is trying to change the narrative about how legislators and the public see currently and formerly incarcerated people. And we go and we tell our personal stories about our experience with the criminal justice system as being experiences as youth, and try to get them to incorporate more trauma-informed and age-appropriate consequences for youth. And we've been seeing some progress. Right now, like 22 states have abolished life without parole in the United States, as opposed to 5 just a few years ago. I think 2012 was only 5 that abolished it. And even here in Illinois, the state that we had the first juvenile court, we recently raised the age. Well, it was just for the automatic transfers. And now from 15 to 16, which is in the right direction, but definitely not where we want to be. But we have seen that now, even with kids who have been charged with violent crimes, that they are not being transferred to adult court now that they have more discretion. Judges have more discretion to look at that. And also we were able to pass a bill, which is the first one to raise the age to 21 for a youth for parole bill, using the brain development science and things like that, to explain to them that, you know, these youths we should raise the age to at least 21, but maybe all the way up to 24, 25 years of age.
Yeah. That's really good stuff. And one of the participants is asking for the names of some of these resources that we are talking about in the legislation. I see somebody posted something from Illinois and the clemency work, so that's great. I want to say I was referring to the Advancement Project's publication called We Came to Learn. Earlier, I misspoke about the title of one of the publications called Cops and No Counselors. And that one is published by the ACLU. So you can Google and find both of those. And like Kelly said, we can certainly create an annotated bibliography with the statistics and with a number of publications that I think all of us are referring to.
Thank you, Chris. And the organization that Marshan mentioned, it was Incarcerated Children's Advocacy Network, ICANN. So that's the one that he mentioned. And Marshan, thank you so much for, talking about the narrative, and that's something that we, want to be very conscious of. And so right now we're going to hear from Elizabeth, and she's going to talk about the role that the media is playing in kind of creating a narrative about, you know, who's considered criminal, what's considered normal adolescent behavior, and how the media could be doing a better job of it.
Thanks so much. So can everyone, you can hear me? So I think that kind of, to me, the best way to start is by talking about the media coverage of the Central Park 5 case. And I think that's instructive. Obviously, they were accused of a very, very serious crime that they did not commit. But I think it's instructive because it really shows how the media plays a huge role in criminalizing youth of color. What I do, I teach a class on wrongful convictions at Rutgers, and I do an exercise with them where we read the New York Times coverage, and we ask, I ask, okay, so what is this? What do you think of the people who were, accused of these crimes? And no one says children, no one says young people or high school students or junior high students or whatever it might be, right? And what you see in that coverage, right, is that the media did not ever treat those kids as kids. And then what I do is I show the trailer from When They See Us. When you see, they are very much children. And so our job as journalists and as consumers of the media is to always remind our readers that we're talking about children, whether that's for something that is adolescent behavior that's being criminalized, or whether it's a very, very serious charge. That's our job, is to really put this in context for the readers, because what we have, right, is the state is telling their side of the story, and their side of the story is that this is an aggravated assault that took place at a school and put all of these kids' lives at risk. Well, our job as journalists is to look much deeper at that and see, was this a schoolyard fight that was criminalized because they have cops in the schools? And our job is really to challenge the state's version of the case, which is that this is somehow, criminal behavior that we have to be protected from. Instead, what we want to do is remind them that we're talking about kids. And I think the other thing that's really, really important is to not sort of silo off coverage where maybe you're writing a story on police officers in schools, and then there's a crime story about, an alleged crime that occurred in schools, but those two issues aren't meeting. When you are covering, really any issue, but I think in particular when you're covering crime and young people, you really have to bring in context, right? And so you want to bring in the context of, as the point has been made today, right? If you're talking about something that's happened in a school, you want to bring in and talk about, well, why do we have cops in schools in the first place, right? Kind of broaden your reader's imagination to imagine, a world where we don't have cops in schools. And that's all about kind of how you decide to frame the story, right? You can frame the story by saying there was a fight at the school and 10 kids were charged with aggravated assault, or you can frame the story as one about the school to prison pipeline. And so that, again, is really about who you're speaking with and what kind of context that you're bringing in to the story. I think there was, and I think also with the context, this is something I see that always really frustrates me, is when we look at stories, and this can be for, an incident that is serious or not serious, and we see that there was some confession made. Whenever a young person offers a confession, whenever that is in a news story, the reporters have an obligation to talk about how vulnerable young people are when they are speaking to authority members, whether it's in a school, on the street, in the police precinct. And so there should never be sort of a mention of an admission of some sort of guilt without that context in it. And we really don't see that enough. And let me just see if there was anything else. I think that the point that the other speakers made was really, I think they really hit the nail on the head, which is, we need to unpack what's really happening. That robbery charge, what does it actually look like? And not just parrot the prosecutor's office's talking points about it. So I think I will leave it there and open it up to everybody else.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I know that we're like past the hour. So right now, I would love to hear from all of the panelists about, the work that you're doing in addressing these inequities, and how our volunteers can, if possible, be engaged with them.
At the Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative, one of our core missions is racial justice and racial justice reform in the juvenile justice system, often in partnership with our wonderful National Juvenile Defender Center, which is down the street. So some of the work that we're doing is around community education to whatever extent that we can. We have a wonderful community organizer on staff. So we also have my colleague, Professor Eduardo Ferrer, who is our policy leader, and he helps us engage particularly around the school to prison pipeline, sitting on coalitions, developing coalitions. And so you asked the question, what can we do? One of the ways is to either participate by getting a seat at the table in area coalitions or local coalitions. And if there is no local coalition, if there is no table, then create the table, right? So build a coalition and invite others to join, and you'd be surprised at how willing folks are to join. And so questions around school to prison pipeline, decriminalizing marijuana, and the like, it's about getting at the table, finding allies in the work, and sometimes unlikely allies in the work. So that's an example of some of the work that we're doing. We also believe in, obviously, we're a defender clinic, meaning we represent kids in delinquency court. So really, whatever seat you sit in, advocating for access to counsel for all children in the juvenile justice system, but in particular, insisting that defenders get training around implicit racial bias and racial justice, so that the narratives, right, are shared, as Elizabeth talked about, so that we have accurate narratives shared in juvenile courts, and more importantly, that we have not only adolescent appropriate responses to normal adolescent behavior, but that we have responses to adolescent behavior that are fair and equitable for children of colors. And I think as defenders, defense attorneys, we have an obligation to give voice to those narratives and to insist upon equity. So that's another area. Our clinic also has a proximity project in which we engage. We say to the world, we don't need courts to give services to our children, mental health services and the like, so or basic educational supports, tutoring, mentoring, and the like. People say, I want to get the kid in the system to get him help. I don't need you. I don't need the system to get my kid help. Can we engage the local community in pairing up local volunteers with kids? So that's one of our projects. We are deeply, deeply committed to research and creative legal strategies. So we've got our ambassadors for racial justice newly launched in January. We're creating an online resource portal for juvenile defense attorneys in particular around racial justice, but it's thinking creatively and strategically about policy reform, policy reform and litigation strategies around racial justice. And so I'd be happy to share some of the research and writing that I have done around understanding what it means to be a reasonable Black child in the juvenile justice system, and what are some of those implications, as well as some other research that advance some of these strategies.
Thank you, Chris. Randy, do you want to talk about the work that you're doing?
Well, I know we're running short on time, so what I'd like to do is say a little bit more about implicit bias and what Chris talked about with regard to the trainings she's doing to teach people about implicit bias, I think are crucially important. I think all of us need to recognize that we suffer from implicit bias. That's certainly true of all of us white people, but it's also true of lots of people of color. And I think the first step has to be facing up to one's own implicit bias. Now, Chris mentioned that public defenders need to be trained to present narratives about people of color to judges and decision makers, and that's certainly important, but as Chris well knows, and as we all need to recognize, public defenders need to face up to their own implicit bias. And there's a person named Song Richardson who's written a wonderful article about this, who points out that public defenders may think that they are immune from implicit bias, but of course they're not. And so implicit bias may be affecting the ways that they are handling their cases. So this is all crucially important. There's a classic study in the 90s of a bunch of probation officers in Washington state whose probation reports were examined. And what was found was when they looked at kids with identical convictions and identical backgrounds in terms of how many prior convictions they had, they would tend to see white kids as being needing services and being afraid, and they would look at kids who were African American who had the exact same backgrounds and say, these kids are hardened criminals. And it was all in the heads of the probation officers. And so in order to try to get through the kinds of problems that are afflicting the criminal justice system and the juvenile justice system, we have to train people to be aware of their own implicit bias and to stop succumbing to it.
Thank you, Randy. Elizabeth, do you want to talk a little more about the work that the Appeal is doing?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm really lucky to get to work at the Appeal. And one of the things I love so much about it is that we do really try to reframe those narratives. We write a lot about young people who are involved in the legal system, who are over-policed. And we, first and foremost, talk about them as young people, as teenagers, as children, and we explain what that means, what it means in terms of their brain development, and also what it means in terms of what is needed for them to succeed. And, as the point has been made, right, we do not want, our prison system and our, court system to be providing services for young people. That is not what we want to happen. And so we really try to frame the stories as, the best thing for a young person is to not be in the system at all. That if a young person is in the system, we don't really put the fault on the young person. We put it on the prosecutors who make the charging decisions, the teacher who called the police, the police officer who chose to arrest the child. It's their responsibility to keep kids out of the legal system. And so we really try to report on these issues in a way where someone can see themselves or their own child in someone who's gotten caught up in the system. And we look for we always remind people that there are other choices that can be made. It's just not inevitable that, kids are in court or kids are in prison, that's actually a really sort of reprehensible idea to begin with.
And finally, Marshan.
Thank you. I actually touched on some of this earlier, my work with ICANN, and I actually work for an organization here in Illinois called the Restore Justice Foundation, and we are an organization that focus on individuals who are serving what we consider de facto life without parole or more, so it's 40 years or more, and who have been incarcerated before the age of 25 years of age. And we call it the deep end because no one really want to work there. They want to, most organizations here and in other states focus on individuals who are serving shorter periods of time than that. But our organization engages in advocacy trainings. We do advocacy days. So that's one of the ways that the volunteers can get involved with learning how to become advocates if they don't already know. and also attending like an advocacy day in Springfield to talk to legislators about the laws and what can be done to change it, and particularly how laws that affect youth. So they can come and get involved with us or any other organization that does this work as well, and just participate. I'm sorry.
No, that's perfect. So thank you, Marshan, Chris, Randy, and Elizabeth for being on this panel. Before we wrap up, Molly is going to talk a little bit about how our attendees can be more involved with the Justice Volunteers.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kelly, and thank you again to our 4 panelists for joining us and sharing your time and thoughts. And thank you again to all of the volunteers who are joining us today and our other webinars as well. One of the things we try to do at Justice Volunteers is to echo and amplify all the work you just heard about from our 4 panelists and other groups doing really important work, advocacy and otherwise across the country and across a lot of different issues. Just very briefly, we sort of have 3 main teams at Justice Volunteers that ties directly into a lot of the things that we've heard today. The first is a research team that does research on a lot of different topics, sometimes really big databases, sometimes small, more local projects, to try and break down the lack of transparency that exists around a lot of things in the criminal legal system. The second main team is one that does media amplification, so uses social media and then networks, otherwise, to share really important messages and framing. And I think, as we heard from Elizabeth and our other panelists today, it's really, I think, on us that care about these issues to try and frame and talk about these issues in a different way than we normally do, to try and break down the barriers to understanding these issues on a deeper level. And then the third one is an action team. So that is more directly involved with the work that we heard about, trying to connect volunteers to organizations where they live that are already doing really important work, and then figuring out ways that people can participate locally. And then, as Professor Henning said too, supporting volunteers in building the coalitions where they don't exist already. So we have just a poll that's going to pop up on your screen right here. The first is asking if you'd be interested in helping us with a project to support juvenile justice. This is our 2nd webinar this month as part of Youth Justice Action Awareness Month. So we'd love for you to join us. We certainly have some action and media amplification projects coming up in the next couple of weeks. But of course, this work extends far beyond October. And so we'd love for you also to join some of our other teams. You can check the boxes for the teams that I mentioned that you might be interested in. And then the final question is to join Slack, which is the main mechanism that we use to stay in touch and connect volunteers across the country. So thank you so much for filling that out. Thank you again to panelists and for those to being here. And I'll hand it back over to Kelly to wrap up.
Thank you, Molly. Unfortunately, we do not have time for questions. However, your questions are incredibly important to us. So if you could send them to volunteer@thejusticecollaborative.com, we will do our best to get to them and get them to the panelists so that they can respond. And so before you go, we would love to get your feedback about how this webinar went. So there's a poll that should be coming up asking you your thoughts about the webinar and what issues you would like us to focus on in the future. And I can tell you that next month's webinar will focus on ending the death penalty, and that will actually be our last webinar for the year. So be sure to tune in for that one. And so thank you again to Chris, Marshan, Randy, and Elizabeth, and thank you to our volunteers. Enjoy the rest of your day.